My name's Jane Hilton, and I'm the VP of Strategic Objectives for SureFast. So I've been working on the pilot with the team, with the SureFast team since its inception. So I wanted to just remind us, we have a number of stakeholders and a number of groups for the pilot itself. And this is SureFast Community Economies Pilot Founding Forum. So the Founding Forum is the group of funders who are coming together to make the pilot possible. So those in the room with us today include some of the people on the pilot team, as well as those who are contributing very generously to the pilot. So $50,000 plus towards making the pilot a possibility. And so you might recall that we committed to convening quarterly. So part of what we're wanting to do is, of course, keep you updated on what's happening throughout the pilot. But we're also wanting to engage you in the ideas and the process and get your feedback. There are a number of people in here. There's a lot of collective knowledge around community economic development. And so we're wanting to make sure that as we are going along with our process and sharpening our action plan, that you're part of that with us. So we'll update you today. Dora Asia, our project manager, is going to be sharing an update on the pilot itself and kind of where we've taken it to date with our various stakeholder groups. But we consider you very much one of those stakeholder groups and wanting to have you informing our work today with us. The other part that we committed to was just talking through the ideas in terms of, leading thinkers in this space. So today we've got both Zita going to be sharing her own philosophy on philanthropic giving, as well as Andrew Chunalal with the Community Foundations of Canada. And so we want to make sure that today becomes a bit of a dialogue and hoping that you'll contribute, and we'll be going through a bit of a sort of program, but wanting people to jump in. We don't expect everybody to agree with what's said today. We hope that we're going to provoke a little bit with some new thinking and some pushing on some of the more traditional ways that philanthropy has played a role. But today is really about exploring the role of philanthropy in community economic development. So there's some inherent tensions in that, and we hope that we'll kind of call them out and push and pull them together a little bit. So before we jump in, I just want to acknowledge that I'm calling in from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee of the Wendat peoples. And Toronto's covered by Treaty 13, which was signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. So as we're thinking about our topic today, many institutions are colonial institutions. They have a history that we need to reckon with. And I think as we're talking through, we'll be thinking about issues of power, sharing power, and it all kind of has a relevance to what we're experiencing as this moment of collective reckoning with healing and reconciliation. So I'm going to jump in and pass it over to Dora. I'm looking for you on my screen. There you are. So Dora is going to, kind of remind us of where we're at, or share with us where we're at in terms of our process. We've gone through some strategic planning for the pilot recently. Some of you have been a part of that. And, I just want to set the stage again that this is very much a three-pillar approach. So we're talking communities, government, and businesses. And we're thinking through, as we're considering our work today, where does philanthropy fit within that framework? So that'll be part of our discussion. So Dora, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jane. Hi, everyone. I'll just walk us through a few slides to give you a bit of an update on where we are with the work, as Jane explained. Just keep in mind the material that I'm sharing right now and the information, and at the end of the session, we'll have a discussion around some of the priorities that we've been that have been emerging through the work that we've been doing. But feel free, if you have any questions, to drop them in the chat or jump in. It's all good. So a little bit to cover around the work that we've done to date. So really it focused on the first 3 months of the pilot, focused on engagement, data collection, and planning. We had 5 sessions with the prototype communities, and really been building kind of our network and how we work together. In addition to that, we also had some community conversations. So Michelle Baldwin from Community Foundations of Canada and myself met with each of the community teams or the groups to have a conversation, set some expectations, understand the specific context and interests and kind of desires and hopes for this pilot from their perspective, which really helped us shape our understanding of how to continue working with this group. A lot of the people here are also overlapping in that group, so you're all aware of that work. In addition, we also did an environmental scan, and Michelle Sparrow from our organization really been working on that. It's still kind of work in progress, and we're going to continue doing the scan and continue expanding the scan as we go along. But I'll speak in a few minutes around what kind of the main insights are that came out of it. We had a literature review conducted by Professor Audrey Jamal from University of Guelph. And she's started to work on that piece, and it will be very foundational for many of the case studies and the rest of the work that will follow. And a big part of the work has just been really building those relationships and the partnerships, both with the core partners, but also with organizations like ESRI and Deloitte, and exploring possibilities and potential for working together. And all of this is feeding into a process that we've been engaging in the past month, which is the strategic planning process. We had a couple of sessions, and we've engaged with the prototype communities too through the session that we had with them. And part of it is also today the conversations that we'll have and your feedback on some of our priorities and helping us shape those pieces. And parallel to all of this, we started engaging through Cody with Dr. Paula Romano, who is a developmental evaluator who will be joining the pilot and really supporting our process. So I'll invite Paula to just say a few words about developmental evaluation to give you a little bit of context and perspective on what that means for this pilot and in general.
Great, thanks, Dor. And hello, everybody. Happy to meet you all, even if virtually. Some of you have heard me talking about this ad nauseum, so I'll keep it very brief. Just a very high level explanation of what a DE is. Developmental evaluation is a form of evaluation, but unlike other types of evaluation, the one we're probably most familiar with is a summative evaluation, where you measure a project or a program against a set of predetermined outcomes. A DE is more useful for tracking innovation, where you have a general idea of where you want to get to, but you're not quite sure what it's going to look like as you get to it. Because you're doing stuff that's never been done before. And of course, the community economies pilot fits very nicely into this theme of innovation. So I have been engaged, or Cody, I work at the Cody Institute and the Center for Employment Innovation to conduct a DE. And so right now I'm in the process of going back to the beginning and doing sort of a prequel DE, if you will, just going right back to the initial idea. Ideally, a DE starts at the beginning of a project or a program, but in this case, obviously we aren't. So we're going to go back and look at what's come up this to date. And I'm just in the process of engaging in that right now. And to that end, I may well be through Dor contacting some of you just to do very short interviews, just to have a bit of a chat about your role in this and your thoughts around this whole project. So the DE is really about asking questions, and we use a framework of what, so what, and now what. So what is it that we're seeing? What does that mean? And then now that we know what it means, or at least have some idea, where is it going to take us? And it's very useful because it allows a project or a program to tweak as it goes along. So it's a learning piece. You go through various phases, which are usually determined by significant events or decision points that are being made. And if you go off down, sort of make a decision and it's not working out quite as well as you thought it was, it allows you to go back and see where that decision was made and then tweak and adjust and maybe go down the other road. We call those forks in the road. It's very much about learning, and it's very much about allowing us to tweak. So we are in that process right now, and I really, it's a fascinating project. I'm really enjoying it. If any of you have any questions, I'm always happy to answer them, but I suspect, Dor, we may or may not have time to do that right now. So I'll pass it back to Dor.
Sure. Thank you, Paula. Let me reshare my screen here. There we go. Okay, so I just wanted to share a little bit of what we've been hearing from the prototype community so far. A few of the insights that came up through those conversations and through the engagement of the group. So first of all, one major theme that's been coming up is really the focus on Indigenous reconciliation and equity as an important dimension of the work. And really what that means for us is really to consider it as we think about the different governance structures, and we think about different engagement and whose voice is shaping the work that we're doing. And also thinking about different ways of organizing that could be offered through an Indigenous lens. Related to that is also the idea of community engagement and really centering community members in decision-making. It's really a common theme through all the 5 communities that are participating right now. And our next session is going to talk about that through the governance structures and also through community engagement, which are really linked together to start thinking about that. There is a desire for a deeper dialogue around what governance structures look like as we think about the 3 pillars of government, business and markets, and community, and how do we start bringing those together. And something that came up as a strong desire from everyone is really to focus also on failures and understanding what hasn't been working, and not just what's successful and what's working. To bring in those transparent and real conversations around how we can learn from those situations. And the last piece is really around research data and case studies that is really important for communities, both in terms of highlighting and helping to build the case for support, but also in terms of informing and educating and building that momentum that we're trying to build. So that's the stuff that we heard from the prototype communities. And then I want to also share a little bit about some of the insights that came out of the environmental scan. And in the environmental scan that Michelle did, we really looked at all 3 pillars. We looked both at community and different networks and organizations that are similar or that are operating in a similar way to what we're trying to do, as well as how government is funding community economic work, economic development work, and as well as some of the big players in the business world. And so some of the insights, and I think the most important one, is that really there is a gap around a national initiative that centers place-based approaches in community economic development, which was also very reassuring to us in terms of the direction that we're trying to take and go. We did see that there is a shift in how the funding landscape in Canada because of the pandemic. And that there is an increased awareness of the need to invest in communities from government, business, and philanthropists. And of course, it's not a surprise, but the federal government is the largest funder of economic development in Canada, although the business sector has increased its funding to community economic development in recent years. And one insight that we did think it would be important to share at this point is that really larger network organizations, which is the direction where we're trying to go in, they tend to also engage in research and in thought leadership, and they try to leverage the knowledge and the relationships that are happening on the ground through their members in order to create system change. So that's just kind of a common theme that we see through the different networks that we looked at. And I also wanted to share, just to put it up there, around kind of the 4 the most relevant, I think, national networks in Canada that are operating in the space. The Canadian Community Economic Development Network, or CEDNET, is really kind of similar in concept to some of the work that we're trying to do, although it doesn't have the place-based approach in quite the same way in the 3-pillar approach. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities operates in a bit of a similar way. Canadian Urban Institute, which is also part of this project, and Future Cities Canada. These are just examples to give you a little bit of context and kind of the kind of networks that we've been looking at. But obviously there's many others, and we continue scanning and looking at different pieces as we go. And so all of that just helped us really understand what makes us different as an initiative and as a group. And it's these three dimensions that we've identified through this work. So first and foremost is the centering of place and place-based definition of community as an organizing principle in the economic development work. The second piece is really around starting with community as the unit of change, but recognizing that community is the unit of change within a globalized world. So making those connections between community as the place where we want to impact change, but still thinking about the change that we're trying to impact in a globalized world and on that level. And our work in all of that is to develop ways and tools to strengthen community economies in order to influence the global systems. And the third piece is really, and we've been talking about this from the beginning, is the three-pillar approach, and recognizing that we really do need to impact all three pillars and engage all three pillars and also create those connections between them. So this is kind of where our thinking is at right now in terms of our understanding of the initiative and where we want to go. And I'm going to share just one more slide before I'll pass it back to Jane, just around the emergent pilot priorities that are coming up. And I grouped them into these 5 buckets, I guess. The first one is really around the network building. And the priority there is really to continue working with the prototype communities to build the network, but also to find opportunities to support work on the ground. And really galvanized around some of the critical issues that they are facing, but also starting to look at other communities and other networks and how we engage those. The platform development, and when we say platform, we mean it in a kind of not just on a technical or virtual sense, but more in terms of the space that we're trying to create for communities. So it's starting to think about the business structure and the business model and how we sustain this beyond the pilot. And also thinking about creating the virtual container to hold that knowledge and context and needs. Thinking about public engagement and how we start shifting mindsets. Some of that work is really about taking the space and putting ourselves very visibly within this space. But another piece is really around starting to build those courses and economic transparency tools and case studies to help shape the way people are thinking about economic development in a different way. Data and measurement, developing those metrics and thinking about how do we measure economic well-being within a community and starting to understand what do we have and what do we not have. And then the last one right now is public policy and starting to think about how are we going to impact public policy and influence it. So that's where we are at right now. You'll notice that there's nothing in this slide about philanthropy. And so we're hoping that part of the conversation today will be also around how does philanthropy fit into the priorities of the pilot. But I won't open that right now. We'll have that conversation at the end. And I hope that you hold this information in your head as we go into the next parts of the afternoon. And then we can have a fuller conversation after that. So back to you, Jane.
Great. Thank you, Dor. So we're going to turn it over to the conversation part of today. And as Dor mentioned, we've got time sort of allotted at the end for Q&A, and we can kind of get good group dialogue going. But we also love, as Zita would say, a good bun fight. So lob some questions as we go along here. You can put them in the chat. You can raise a hand. It would be great to get some conversation going. So I will say that, I know that Zita thinks about our work in this pilot as really making it possible for local communities to thrive within the global economy. And so that's part of what we're trying to do. And of course, as she thinks about her own philanthropic giving, that's kind of the lens that she's bringing to our work and organizing our team around, certainly. So Andrew is going to be her partner here and, kind of diving into how she thinks about philanthropy and how SureFast is organized around philanthropic giving, both Zita's own personal giving, as well as the support of many generous people like yourselves. So here we go. I'll turn it over to you, Andrew and Zita.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Dor, for setting us up so nicely this afternoon. And welcome to all the community foundations that are on this call from Peterborough and Ottawa, London, Victoria, Nova Scotia, Hamilton, and Prince Edward County. And there was no rhyme or reason for pulling those specific community foundations together. But after those 7 have come on board and I take a look at it, there couldn't be 7 more different local economies than the ones that we have here, just across the country. One is even located on actually 2 are located on islands, rural, urban, big, small. It's just very diverse and very different. And why I point that out is as we engage in this work, in this pilot, in this experiment, and we learn new things, we're going to learn it through the vastness and the depth through which Canadian economies are built from coast to coast to coast. And so certainly wasn't intentional, not on from my part, but I think a natural consequence and something that we'll take a lot from. So welcome to all of you, and including our partners from Cody and the Canadian Urban Institute, and of course, North Pine. My name is Andrew Chalal, and I'm so honored here to be interviewing and talking to Zita Cobb about her journey as a businesswoman and now as a philanthropist. But I don't know that she's left the business piece behind. It probably carries it with her every day. And normally I would provide Zita's bio and talk a little bit about Zita before we engage in the conversation, but I'm not going to do that. I think a lot of you know who Zita Cobb is and knows her story, but instead I'm going to pull out the important pieces of her story and her bio as we have this discussion over the next 30 minutes. And this is meant to be provocative. As Zita said to me the other day, we should have a tussle. So we're going to attempt to do that. And it's an important time to have this conversation in our country's history. As many of you will know, there was an important piece of work that concluded last week in our sector around the disbursement quota. And the disbursement quota is really centered at this conversation in so many ways. And for those of you who don't know what the disbursement quota is, we call it the DQ in the sector, and oftentimes people confuse it with Dairy Queen. But the disbursement quota is a calculation. It's a very simple calculation. It's the application of a percentage, in this case 3.5%, to assets that are not typically used in charity and administration of foundations. And then it calculates an amount of money that we have to spend every year. It's called a floor, disbursement quota floor. It's there for a specific reason, to prevent the accumulation, the unnecessarily accumulation of assets over time in a particular organization. And when I read through a lot of the disbursement quota submissions last week, a lot of them highlight the thing that we're going to talk about today, and that is the need and the desire to modernize and to bring new tools to the way that we work in philanthropy. And so our conversation will be centered around that. So Zita, first question. It's an interesting moment in the world. And why I mention that is there's a lot of curiosity and a lot of attention being paid to people who have a lot of money. The elite, the wealthy. And in fact, just a couple of days ago, I was reading about the Pandora Papers. And before that, it was the Panama Papers. And there was another set of papers before that. And so the world, the globe is looking on at certain individuals that hold a lot of money, that hold a lot of capital, power, and influence. And they want to know, what are they doing with all of that? Are they meeting their responsibilities as global citizens? Or are they trying to evade certain responsibilities and accountabilities that they may have, or to the place where they generated their wealth? And you're no different. You also are a wealthy individual, and you've created a lot of wealth through hard work and risk-taking and entrepreneurship, and everybody knows that story so well. And I'm going to ask you to reflect on your journey, particularly through university and coming into adulthood and into the corporate world. Reflect on your relationship with money, your relationship with the system of capital, and then take us to the point where you became a wealthy woman. and just stop there. And then I will ask the next question. So over to you.
Andrew, that's a long question, or a long setup to a question. I'm not sure. Anyway, hi, everyone. So let's see where to start. Well, I am 63 years old now, and since I was 10, I feel like all I've been doing is trying to navigate the relationship between the local and the global. Because when I was 10, the global arrived at our doorstep, and my father, who had absolutely no economic logic at all and no money, because we just traded fish, said they must be turning the fish into money. That was the only explanation that he could come up with, because he knew what it was. We didn't have any, and it didn't matter in our lives. It wasn't that we wanted it. It just wasn't a thing. And he said, you have to figure out how this money system works. Otherwise, it's going to eat everything we love. And so I was 10. And in my career, probably if I was a specialist in anything, I mean, I was a finance professional, but really I was an M&A specialist. And I started working for a small company that was privately owned and deeply, deeply rooted in a place. And I know Marco's here somewhere on the call, and Marco will know the founders of this company came out of Nortel, which had a deep relationship in the places that it was in. And I joined a company that had 89 people, and I left a company 12 years later that had 40,000 people. And through that, I went through private ownership, deep local relationships, to being owned partly by an enormous Japanese conglomerate, and how that then changed how our company was evolving to the point that we went public to dilute them. And then we merged with a big American company. And then I spent 2 years going around the world buying, several dozen companies. And in all of that, I realized that I'm always working around the question or preoccupied somehow with the question of dignity and economic dignity in particular. Because whether I was standing in Australia buying a company from someone that grew up in that place and started his own little company, and we were good owners, at JDS Uniphase, we really were good owners, but ultimately we were distant owners. And it is such a hard thing to ever reconcile, but we have to work at it. That's all there is to it. We just have to work at it. And I think I had this responsibility for integrating all of these many companies and many people around the world. And it was always trying to understand people in their place and how to do that. And I don't think I've got it figured out, that's for sure. But I do know we have to approach it from both sides. But Andrew, the question I think I've asked you, and I would ask everyone here, is if you could put one thing on a t-shirt that everyone in the world would get a t-shirt and it would be in their language, what would you say? Maybe we'll ask you at the end of the call. I would say it matters who owns what, because owners determine the business models and the business models determine the outcomes. And that is what's going to determine the outcomes for the places in which we live. Did I come anywhere near answering your question?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that.
I think you told me I'm wealthy and I'm a member of the elite at the same time, but I'm not commenting on that.
Well,
I thought you had to be smart to be a part of the elite. Do you?
Already skirting my question, Zita, but that's okay. Let's
to make them sharper. You got to get them in sharper.
For sure. Let's stay on this concept of ownership, because I think that brings us into an interesting space. Like, ownership is clearly defined in the corporate world. We have share capital corporations. They're either public or private. We know who owns them. When we step into the space of community economic development and localism and the assets that exist, particularly institutional assets like philanthropic ones, reflect on that in terms of ownership, because ownership isn't as explicit in the philanthropic world or in the nonprofit world.
I mean, ownership is ultimately who controls whatever that thing is. And I think when we are working on local economies, we look around, we do take this 3-pillar approach. Although, Andrew, a question for you, maybe we should be talking to Professor Rajan about adding a 4th pillar. Maybe philanthropy has to be its own pillar, and then we would examine it differently. But I think for an economy, wherever that economy is, it matters to that place who owns the businesses in that place, for example, because those owners are going to have different kinds of relationships with the place. I personally wouldn't want to live in a community that had an enormous influence by, say, Jeff Bezos, because I don't think he gets up in the morning and thinks about place at all. And I'm a bit too young to be hippie, so I'm not suggesting that everything should be owned locally, but I think some things can be and perhaps should be, and it really depends on the size of the community. I happen to be sitting in a community that the two big industries are owned actually literally by the community through, one's a cooperative, the fishery, and the other one is the inn, which is owned through this charitable model. But really, if you look around a place like this, or most places in our country, what is it, 70% of the businesses are SMEs? 70% of the employment are SMEs. So I think we're facing an enormous precipice coming up in our country around how those businesses transfer ownership. And when we think about ownership, you can think about it as a kind of a spectrum of concentrations, because, you know, they get gobbled up, and distance from where the communities that they operate in. So I think the closer they are, the more dispersed they are, the kind of better in general. But this is a big design problem. We have to design at the right scale for the problem we're facing. And I don't know if anyone's been paying attention to Andrew Potter's book about the end of the world, or what's it called, the decline of civilization, or some such thing. He basically says we don't have the institutions or the architectures to even tackle the problems that we're facing. And that's what we have to design for. That's what we have to build.
So in terms of institutions and architecture, Zita, after you left the corporate world, you came home. Reflect on what that journey was like, because this, I assume, was your first entry point into philanthropy, and really coming back to your dad's original question when you were 10 years old is, how do you do it differently? How do you design? How do you have the architecture to really bring ownership back to community and deploy capital in a different way?
Yeah, there was a bit of a step in between, because actually I was doing two things. I was, after I left JDS, besides sailing, I started a project in Rwanda, and it was really a simple project with CARE USA to distribute solar powered wind-up radios post-genocide to child-headed households. I know that's a mouthful. And as I progressed with that work, I started to get really uncomfortable that I didn't know what I was doing. I don't know the Rwandan communities. I don't know them culturally. And I really started to get uncomfortable, especially as CARE wanted to start developing content for the radios. It's like, I don't know what I'm doing. And really, I'm dabbling. And at the same time, I had this scholarship program at home. And I think people have probably heard this before, but we were doing a review of the scholarships when a woman, actually someone I went to high school with, stood up and said, well, you're just paying our kids to leave. Can't you do something to actually create employment here? And so that was the moment I really tipped from giving to giving and doing. And I mean, and that was 15 years ago. And as soon as I started down that path, as the mayor said to me at the time, he said, well, welcome to the world of community economic development. He said, you will know your work has started when someone sticks a finger in your face at a community meeting. So that happened very early on, about a dozen years ago. And so I thought, okay, I guess I've started. But really, this work is still about trying to reconcile the local with the global, because we need them both. We have them both. That's the reality of the world that we are in. I was super worried. I always worry about not creating a kind of dependency, which is why I think business is so important. Like if I bring anything home or to anywhere, I hope it's kind of a spirit of entrepreneurship, and that anybody can start a business, anybody can own a business. And that to me is what do we call it in the business world? The dynamism that we need for our economy to work. I don't want to create a culture of dependency. I think I'd been only home for maybe a year when I ran into someone at the gas station who said, is it some kind of new age charity or new age welfare officer? Like, what is it exactly that ShoreFast is? And so as the businesses have started, I think people start to understand it differently. But really, I thought about it as taking money, the money that was in the charity called ShoreFast, bringing it home and investing it in assets that would be economic engines for the community, and I can die happy and know that it's going to carry on for a lot longer and beyond my lifetime before it becomes someone else's problem. And so it's interesting when people call money sometimes money, we say assets when we mean money. Like money is one asset. I don't think money held in that form does anything. It's just kind of dead. And so what I think about is turning it into other assets. Maybe my dad would think we were turning it into fish because we're building a market for a higher quality fish where the fishers take fewer and get a higher price. So that's actually turning money into fish. So I think that's the exciting thing about money. And I think that's the essence of entrepreneurship. What can we turn money into?
Mm-hmm. So oftentimes I hear you say this quote, it's being of sane mind, I spent my money. Is that what you mean by that?
Exactly. And so, I mean, if it's, I do think that our Canadians have given us this free pass around paying tax on the money that's gone into our philanthropic coffers. And I don't think they intended us to keep it as money. And sometimes people will look at what we are doing out here and go, my God, what a big risk. And I said, well, it just depends on most people, when they think about risk, think about financial risk. But we were thinking about cultural risk and the risk of losing an entire community. And so spending money to tackle that risk seemed like not a big risk at all. And so that's how I think about, we turned the money into these economic assets, and we turned it into trying to hold on to things that have value from the past, like heritage restorations, because that contains knowledge. And as they say, everything passes except the past. So we better figure out what to do with it. So yeah, money can do that. Money can do almost anything we ask it, actually.
Right. Zita, when you stepped into philanthropy, you would have looked at the landscape and tried to figure out what are the tools and institutions I want to engage with to advance my philanthropy. You would have come across these things called endowments, which make up a really important part of philanthropy. What did you learn about endowments, and how do you feel about the way that we manage endowments, we invest endowments, and those as tools to deploy capital in the modern era, in a sense to advance some of these local priorities that you've talked about?
Yeah, I don't really understand. I mean, actually, Marco's here, so my career was largely the Canadian part of my career was largely in Ottawa, and so I actually had a fund at the Ottawa Community Foundation. And Barb McGuinness, and she is no doubt smiling down on us and listening carefully to everything that we're saying, was heading up the foundation then. And I wanted to take the money and do this. And Barb said, well, that's just not the way we work. And I said, well, then, honey, I'm taking my money and I'm going home, which is pretty much what I did. And because that model didn't work for what I wanted to do. I mean, I look at the world we're in and I see it's on fire. I think that it's beyond urgent. Like, we've just run out of adjectives. And so it feels like too often we're saving the money for a rainy day when we're in a hurricane. And but we're holding on to the money so that we can be safer later or something. We're holding on to the money, so we can have a world that has no social cohesion and no fresh air to breathe? I don't know. I think Canadians don't expect us to do that.
So you're really hitting on the nature of perpetual or permanent capital. And
money, not capital, money.
Money, nature of forever money. On the balance sheet, and that's certainly something that's being challenged a lot in recent books and writings, and of course submissions to modernize the philanthropic sector. But it sort of brings us to the space of philanthropic sector reform. And much like you, I am a neophyte to philanthropy. I was never trained to do it or to work in it, but I've been learning over the last 15 years, as I'm sure you have. Any thoughts on reform? And I just want to hold the space for two types. One is, what can reform look like from a policy standpoint? And the other is a cultural standpoint. There are some things we just do because we do them. There isn't a policy framework. It's just a norm. It's a tradition. It's a ritual. Could you reflect on those two spaces and give us a sense of what reform might look like to you?
It feels to me from where I sit, and I mean, I run a charity, so I'm in a bit of a different seat. It feels like that world of philanthropy is actually still quite traditional in many places, and hasn't caught up with the contemporary world that we're trying to navigate. I mean, things, I know all these sort of measurements around efficiency of organizations, and too often funders will fund projects, but somehow are allergic to thinking that these projects are run by people, and we need to, build some kind of institutional coherence and a team of people to do that work. I mean, we are trying to make systems change. I come out of, my business career was in a lot of R&D, and I think that we can, maybe not in all aspects of our charitable undertakings, but in some of them, I think we need to think about taking some risks in order to make systems change. Systems change doesn't just happen because we wish it. It happens because we, and to say, I think this pilot that we're gathered around today is one of those, let's do a little test. Let's try to do a little bit of R&D to see how we can move to creating some kind of architectures or institutions that help us together in the 3 or 4 pillars, if we decide there's a 4th, tackle the actual problems we're facing. Mm-hmm. So, but that if we're not going to do that, who's going to do that?
Well, I think that's a rhetorical question, so I'm not the one to answer the questions today, but I will want to stay on the pillars discussion, Zita, and you've talked about the book, The 3 Pillars, and have suggested maybe there should be a 4th pillar. But let's go into one of those pillars, and one of them is business. John Elkington, he coined the term, triple bottom line. And what he means by that is people, place, and planet. And how do we hold those things in a corporate setting equally, such that profit is equal to all the other things that we're working on? And when you put that alongside of the old models or the traditional models of corporate social responsibility, which is, let's just go out and make a lot of money and then we'll give back. But the giving back is subjugated and not equal to the making a lot of money. And those two things are sort of playing out right now in the world for us. And in fact, in 2019, a bunch of business executives, global executives called the Business Roundtable, said that a corporation needs to exist for more than just making money. It needs to have a deeper meaning and a deeper purpose. And so the corporate world is looking at ways of doing things differently. The market's changing. What's our relationship to that? Our being philanthropy. How do we respond and work with that other sector as they sort of think through ways of local inclusive economic development, which is something that they're just not used to?
This is exactly the opportunity. First of all, the old model of we'll make money and then we'll spend it, or we'll do charity or whatever. That doesn't work because we're making more problems than we can fix. We just can't fix things fast enough, and you don't need to be all that focused on the singularity to know that the change is happening so fast we can't. Our ability to keep up with it is just we can't. And so I think that working with corporations that have come to the realization that they want to build whatever language you want to use, but they want to build businesses that are regenerative, let's say, then I think they would be very welcoming and are. And I know some of the people who are funding this pilot are very thoughtful on these things around how to work with philanthropic organizations or charitable organizations that are doing things in more innovative ways that maybe actually incorporates a business model inside of a charity. And, you know, we run the Fogo Island Inn out here. I haven't gotten any complaints. It's owned by a charity, not run by a charity. I haven't gotten any complaints from the Four Seasons that we're hurting their business, you know, but it serves to fuel this place. And I think there are lots and lots of opportunities for charities that are closer to the ground, because we're a part of communities, I think. And actually, that's, if you ask me, I don't think we need a fourth pillar. I think we just, charities and foundations are attached to places. So we're a part of the community pillar. And I think we can be the people that do try out different business models that help support the locals. I mean, look, in Newfoundland and Labrador, we have 600 communities with fewer than 1,000 people. Like, that is a serious big problem and challenge that we can tackle in the three pillar. Will take all three pillars to even begin to imagine, how do we activate the assets that are in those places? Because there are lots of rich assets there. And it's going to take some money. It's going to take some talent. It's going to take some focus, and we're going to have to do it together.
Yeah, and you know, Zita, as the charitable sector thinks out what those new business models are, and there are many that are well down the road on that. Some critics say that there's a blurring of the lines, that in fact you've got non-tax paying organizations, call them charities or nonprofits, that are now stepping into the area of offering and selling commercial products and services. And that's just an unfair competitive landscape. What would you say to those folks?
Well, as I said, if I get a call from Izzy Sharp saying that the Fogo Island Inn is hurting the Four Seasons, we should worry, but I don't think that's going to happen. I just think that let's blur some lines. We all understand that we have created structures that are not serving us all that well. And obviously, to an extreme, it's a problem. I think we need to be really careful, as we have been, to say that charity doesn't run a business. But a charity, that's whatever work it's doing, can have different sources of funding. I think that what's wrong with that, especially on these small scales in, let's just say, the 600 communities in Newfoundland, as an example. Otherwise, I suppose we could write to Jeff Bezos and see if he wants to do something about those 600 communities. I don't think we should expect them anytime soon, which is a good thing.
For sure. Well, Zita, we just have a couple of minutes left here before our time's up. And I just wanted to offer the last question to Atif, who provided it in the chat. And I'll read the first part of the question. And Atif, if you want to chime in and elaborate on it, I'm sure Zita would be happy to answer it. But the question is this: in governance of community, given its place-based definition, how does it focus in on those with the greatest distance to opportunity in regards to social marginalization? Atif, did I capture that well, or do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of just gave an example of one of our portfolio areas of working with formerly incarcerated people, but the example being the average income of someone who's been in prison 14 years after prison is about the social assistance. So basically around 14, 15K annually. The cost to keep someone in prison is anywhere between 80 to 120K annually. And the recidivism rates in Canada are above 20%. So it has one of the greatest ROI, but when you look at the investment into better outcomes for former prisoners in Canada, severely low. And I think a lot of it has to do with the nature of how funding works and is appealing to certain people in Canada. So when we talk about community and place-based approaches, I'm actually wondering how it takes into account the people who are the furthest distance from opportunity. I know, ideally speaking, proximity means that you may have more of a connection with someone, but there's still going to be very vulnerable populations that might be marginalized even in that context.
I would say that, well, let me just clarify what I mean by community. And I think you and I mean the same thing because we come from a very similar place. It's a place where people live in some kind of a tangle with each other. And in an urban setting, to my mind, a community is a neighborhood. And in Newfoundland and Labrador, it generally could mean an island, an entire island. But it's where people live in close physical proximity. So an effective community is one that people understand who's here and what are their needs. And one of the things that we're trying to work on and spit out from our pilot is, what is the right architecture inside a community that allows us to work together in a way that represents the people that are here and is representative of the people that are here and their various institutions, whether it's municipalities, to move forward together. And so if you take someone who's come out of prison and they're like, just like the rest of us, they're actually analog. They're physical creatures. They have got to, as we do, put our head on a pillow somewhere at night, preferably on a pillow and not in the street somewhere. And so they're going to be in a community somewhere, either the one that they were in before they went to prison or some other place. And the better we are, the better, the more cohesion we have as local communities to understand that these people have arrived in our community and have come out of prison and are in this very disadvantaged situation, the better we're able to find those paths for how they are welcomed in. And I think that from my experience, the best solutions to these kinds of things actually happen on the ground, usually when someone is living next to them, as long as we don't allow fear to grow. I think fear has a way of setting off the wrong things. So if we define communities small enough where people in them, like a neighborhood, can actually relate to each other as individuals in a community as opposed to particles in a mass, then we have a hope of saving each other.
Thank you for your question, Atif. And that brings us to the end of our interview with Zita Cobb. Zita, thank you very much. I was expecting more of a hostile witness today, but you were very cooperative in answering all the questions, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, Andrew, it's not over yet.
Back over to you, Jane.
So I'm actually going to be turning it to you again, Andrew. So Andrew, in your role with CFC, I know you've played a big advocacy role in the notions of where philanthropy is headed, the future of philanthropy, what transformation is required. And I shared yesterday Deloitte's Monitor Institute report around what's next for philanthropy in the 2020s. Mm-hmm. And so I think you're going to use that as your frame to talk us through some of your perspectives on the change that's needed. And this in some ways can be provocative too. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you. And I think Dora's going to pull up some slides for us to kick us off. I think I'm just going to take 10 or 15 minutes and just walk through a bit of the what's next in philanthropy. A little bit about me. I live in London, Ontario, born and raised. Actually began in philanthropy at the London Community Foundation. In fact, the previous board chair, John Nicholson, is on this call. And just had a great working relationship with John for quite a few years. Interestingly enough, joined the London Community Foundation in 2007. When I joined, the assets of that particular community foundation were around $32 million. And I was the VP Finance at the time. And when I actually met with the London Community Foundation board last week on Thursday, and their assets are well beyond $110 million now, maybe even a little higher. So just in a very short period of time, 15 years or so, they've almost 4x their asset base. And that's very indicative of all community foundations. If you look at that time frame, there's been a growth in capital, and these organizations have just become more robust, stronger, and doing a lot more with their assets. The community foundation business model is something that we celebrate and acknowledge that has made a tremendous impact in 191 communities across the country. And so I offer that as context because oftentimes I talk about transformation, and people conflate that with making improvements or optimizing what philanthropy does. And it's very different than optimization. Optimization is looking at what you do and trying to do it better. Transformation is actually just trying to do it completely differently. And there's a lot of focus in on philanthropy right now. We are being met with some criticism. There's been some key data points that have shown up over the last year, just during the pandemic. We've not done enough to support and to flow resources into Indigenous communities in this country, as an example, or into organizations that are led or governed by the Black community. So there are certainly gaps in what we're doing, where we've done well, but there's improvements that we can make, and this transformation mindset is about that. So I'm going to go into the report a little bit now and maybe ask Dora to flip to the next slide. The What's Next in Philanthropy report comes from the Monitor Institute, which used to be an organization that existed on their own. And they built a lot of thought leadership, research, data, education, and learning pieces for the charitable sector, both in the United States and in Canada. The Monitor Institute was purchased by Deloitte 4 or 5 years ago. So they're part of the Deloitte enterprise and the Deloitte brand. And they issued a report, as they do every couple of years or so, on the future of philanthropy. And they issued their most recent report just a few weeks ago. And really, they're challenging some of the default settings, some of the conventional norms in philanthropy, and calling us to have that transformational change. The report is supported by many foundations, both on both sides of the border, but the J.W. McConnell Foundation in Canada provided significant resources to bring this report to bear in Canada. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that. I'll ask Dora to go to the next slide. So when they pulled this report together, many people were interviewed. I think everybody has access to the report. I think Jane might have provided that. But they interviewed over 200 philanthropic executives, practitioners, donors, board members, experts, and compiled a landscape review on where philanthropy is going. And so the report's very specific in respect of what are some of the big shifts that are happening in our world, but then also talking about some of the edges that are guiding those shifts that are playing out. And so I'm going to touch on some of the shifts because I think we know the shifts well. We're living with the shifts every day, and then go into a little bit more detail around the edges. Dora, next slide. So this is a nice diagram, and as you can see, around around that half circle, there are 7 shifts: economic inequality, political polarization, shifting demographics, momentum around racial justice, ubiquitous technology, the state of climate emergency, and a social compact in flux. I'm just going to touch on those before we get into the edges. Economic inequality, I think we all understand this quite well. In the last 18 months in Canada, we've seen it exacerbated because of the pandemic. We've seen wealth being created in the stock market. We've seen Canadians who hold financial assets, particularly real estate. We've seen their wealth go up. We've seen others have it eroded at extraordinary paces. If you happen to be working in industries that were disproportionately disadvantaged because of the pandemic, you would have seen a wealth erosion. And that just pulls economic inequality to profound levels. The Gini coefficient is something that measures income inequality, and it's used throughout the world to assess inequality in a particular economy. Canada usually does really well in this area, relatively speaking. Our Gini coefficient is usually in the mid-30s. If the most unequal society has a Gini coefficient of 100, of which nobody has a Gini coefficient of 100, and the most equal would be 0. Countries like India and South Africa have a Gini coefficient usually in the low to mid 60s. My sense is when the data comes in and Stats Canada pulls the most recent data on the Gini coefficient, we'll probably be into the 40s. And so that's just a guess, but we'll see how that plays out. Political polarization, well, I think we were all watching, many of us would have been watching the TV a few weeks ago as we had our political election. Just some startling things, not new, but startling. Clearly, there is a rural-urban divide in this country on political ideology. We saw that in front of us with the maps of where some of the ridings went. We saw that in the U.S. With respect to the American federal election in the fall as well. So we know that that's alive and well in the Canadian context. Shifting demographics. We have a really low birth rate in this country. It's 1.7. The replacement rate, birth rate in any economy is 2.1. So we don't replace ourselves naturally. Puts a lot of pressure on bringing newcomers to Canada. We all know that Canada will probably target immigration at somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 people. But the story really isn't immigration. We've had immigration in this country for a long, long time. It's where the immigration is coming from. And mostly it's coming from the global south. And that's very different when you have immigrants coming from Europe. Our systems in Canada, our laws, our government are really Eurocentric systems. Philanthropy is a Eurocentric system. So as we see those shifts happening because of immigration, more and more people are going to challenge the systems. They won't have an affinity to some of the systems that we have, and they'll be asking questions. Philanthropy is no different. Last year, we had the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. We have been dealing with issues of carding. We've been dealing with issues within reconciliation. And so there's this new momentum around racial justice. And I highlighted 2 data points earlier that the Black community and the Indigenous community are doing their own independent studies and saying, hey, philanthropy in Canada is really not serving us. How can we be part of this discussion? How can we be part of the ecosystem? Ubiquitous technology and access to information. Social media provides an opportunity and a platform for every citizen who's on it to have a voice. Oftentimes that leads to misinformation, mischaracterizations. It can create movements. It can have a very pervasive impact on our work. And so that's something we need to pay attention to. And of course, the state of climate and the social emergency that's playing out. The IPCC had a report that came out a few weeks ago that talked about the seriousness and the urgency of what's in front of us. And Zita talked about that as well. And are we well equipped to deal with that urgency? We're talking about long-term systemic, down the road type work. What happens when the issues are in front of you right now, when literally we are on fire, there's provinces on fire, burning up? How does this philanthropic business model that we have react in those particular instances? The social compact, some people call this the social contract. I think this is an opportunity to think big. After World War II, there was an economist by the name of William Beveridge. He issued the Beveridge Report out of the United Kingdom. And that report was used to define the social compact of its time. And it had some crazy notions and ideas in that report that would stem from universal health care, access to education for all, a national pension system. Like, these were lofty, crazy ideas back in the late 40s, but it formed the social compact or the social contract of not just the United Kingdom, but the entire Commonwealth, including Canada. And we may be at a stage where transformation and this transformation agenda is informing those new big ideas that we might want to engage in. And so the Deloitte report highlights these as big things that are sort of happening around us, and then wants to center us in the middle of that and ask ourselves as philanthropy, as community organizations, what's our role in all of that? So I'll ask Dor to move forward on the next slide. The edges shifting philanthropy. So there's 4 of them, and that's rethinking philanthropy's role. And the community economic pilot is about that. We've never really engaged in this way before, but we're trying to think of what are our new tools, and can we build new tools right now? And so thinking about the work that we do as economic development, as local economic development, is a new frame. The second one is balancing power. We talked a little bit to Zita about the wealth and wealth accumulation and elitism. It's also about catalyzing leverage and then working with others, partners, government, the different pillars that Zita referred to. And of course, the last one is how do we redesign the enterprise? We recognize that our institutions have some shortcomings, and how can we address those? Dora, next slide. I'm just going to dig a little bit into some of these, but not all of them. Maybe pick out the ones that are most pertinent to us. So maybe I'll start with getting out of the way. A lot of times funders want to fund things that are important for the institution itself. They might set a direction and say, hey, you know what, food security is really important here in our community, and we are going to fund things around food security. We're going to take a deep dive and go heavy into that. Oftentimes, that priority may be misaligned with the priority of that broader community. And so we have to think about our funding differently. Maybe we just need to cut the check to the highest performing nonprofits and charities that are doing the best work out there, and then get out of the way. Trust that they're going to do the right thing. And if they don't, well, we fund other organizations. And so it's about getting out of the way, providing more security around where organizations have operational capacity, so they don't need to think about operational capacity. They can think beyond it. They're not always chasing the next dollar to make the payroll, but they have the comfort and the space to really think about the challenges that are in front of them and meet them in the right way. Funding innovation to maximize impact. We'll go back to that slide. I'm going to hit one more, Dora, and then we'll move forward. This really goes to capital. You know, Zita talked about her journey through a few different corporations and mergers and acquisitions, and how capital plays a role in that, whether you're a private or a public enterprise. In our world, in the philanthropic world, we typically fund things through granting. And oftentimes that's a really important component, and it's something that we should always continue to do. However, it doesn't address what's playing out and accelerating in the Canadian economy right now, and that is social enterprises. And these are companies that are led by younger Canadians typically, and are about addressing the triple bottom line that we talked about before, but they don't have access to capital through banks or through venture companies. Can philanthropy show up and be that investment backer for these types of companies to really scale up and have the impact that we want? Do we have a role around our capital that's about getting behind organizations like social enterprises? Dora, to the next slide. Power. A lot of discussion about power and philanthropy. Philanthropy comes from some of the most powerful, wealthiest industrialists of our time. We know who they are, the Carnegies and the Rockefellers. Typically, they bring others to the table that have a lot of power. You know, this goes to Atif's question, which is the distance between where the institution is and where those that lack access to opportunity lie. And organizations like community foundations have a history, not so much the place where we are now, because we've made a lot of progress, but how do we bring those important agents in our community that are closely associated with the issues that we're working on to the board table, to the decision-making table, and closing that gap, so we have a really clear understanding on where our capital is needed and how it needs to be deployed. There was an article in the Future of Good publication that looked at investment committees. Now, almost all philanthropic foundations have an investment committee because your assets are invested. And it looked at the investment committees of, I would say, about 8 or 9 foundations in Canada. And it looked at who was making the decisions on how money was invested. And it was a very narrow demographic. It was one very specific demographic that was overrepresented at the table. It typically were men, and it typically were white men. And that's a lot of power to have. You know, Zita talked about influence. Who's influencing where the capital's going? We need to look at where the power is, who's having influence, and ensuring that those that have the influence really represent the communities in which we operate in. Next, Edge. Dora. Then catalyzing leverage. So how do we unlock and guide capital and align ourselves to the right types of action? And oftentimes we go where the money is. So we're chasing the donor, and then the donor becomes really center to how the capital is deployed, how we unlock capital. And donors are a really important part of this conversation, shouldn't be minimized at all. We really need the donors, but we also need to help the donor understand where the priorities of the community are. Oftentimes that could be misaligned to where the donor's own intentions want to be, but we really need to have an honest conversation. If we're centering capital in community, are we bringing the donor along in that journey so we can appropriately leverage their wealth in the right way that builds out local inclusive economies? Last edge, Dora, edge 4. And so redesigning the enterprise, rethinking what philanthropic organizations look like, addressing governance. At the heart of any organization is culture. And we have to think about what philanthropic culture, where it comes from, and why we have the type of culture that we have, and have that inform where we're going to go next. As I said before, when we talk about shifting demographics, there is a culture in this country that is transforming because of those shifting demographics. And are we evolving our philanthropic institutions to match that cultural change? That's something that we need to think about too when we're redesigning our enterprises. So that brings us to the end. Jane, I think we're probably in a Q&A or something right now. But
yeah, thank you, Andrew. Thank you. And I think what we want to do is link it all back, of course, to the pilot. So Dora, I'm going to get you to bring up that slide again on the emerging priorities. And I think there were a number of comments there going in the chat, much of them around the different measures that we need to consider and the kind of, pros and cons to various measure, indexes that we can use. And a big part of what we're trying to do, and data and measurement, as you can see here, is around what exactly we need to be collecting to link these kind of measures to place and to community. So that's certainly all relevant to here. But in the Deloitte report, I'm just going to read this one little section of it because it does tie to the way we're aiming to work with this pilot. And I will acknowledge that this is, as Zita and many Newfoundlanders would say, it's very tangly work. And it is by its nature, and we need to be in that tangle to do the work, to make the change. So the report talks about how philanthropic networks, so the power of actually coming together, and a big part of our work is, of course, about bringing people together. In this moment, we're talking about philanthropic funders, so funders to come together to identify and engage more of the stakeholders that are essential to addressing an issue. So building that shared understanding of complex problem, mobilizing resources that match the scale of the challenges, working together to test a range of possible solutions and create feedback loops and systems for sharing that can facilitate the collective learning and action. So that feels very akin to what we're trying to do through this pilot. And I think what we want to do is bring it back to the slide that you've got, Dora, around the priorities, and just think through, how does philanthropy fit in here is one of the questions that we certainly want to tackle. What is the role of philanthropy in community economic development, and how can we kind of find that or see that in our priorities? I want to remind us too that, of course, we have 5 prototyping communities that we're working with. And that in and of itself is a learning about, who does represent a community, and some of the challenges for actually asking ourselves as we build governance, new ways of collaborating and governance structures to work together. How do we actually get kind of seats at the table or representation of a community? That's a sort of emerging work as well for us, that we're in the tangle with our prototype communities and thinking that through together. So Dora, you wanted to pose a few particular questions here, did you, to get feedback on the priorities themselves and then the role of philanthropy specifically?
Sure. So these are the questions that we had posed, but I think you also framed it a bit more broadly or specifically around the pilot and the role of philanthropy within it. So really feel free to jump in on any of these. But what we're really trying to understand is a little bit of your perspective on this slide of the priorities that already emerged at this point through the conversations with the product communities, as well as thinking, where does philanthropy fit within all of this, especially based on the conversation that we had today. So I'll just open it up for people's participation now.
I put my little hand up, but I don't know if I have to wait for someone to acknowledge it, or am I allowed to just?
Oh, sorry, I missed it. Jump in, Mary.
And then, of course, the problem is you put your darn hand up, and then how the hell do you get it down? So the bishop said to the actress, just a second. Okay, so I have just a quick question about, thank you, first of all, for these presentations from both Andrew and from Zita and Dor, how you're trying to show us. And there are pilot community reps here in the call and local foundations that are supporting pilots. And then we have the folks from Peterborough who actually don't have an actual participation in the pilot, although I'd love it that we could find a way to start to onboard other communities that need to be part of this conversation. So I'm very pleased to see so many from the Peterborough gang here. I have a question about if we're trying to, and maybe Matt Mendelson may want to come in on this, and I bet Craig Alexander will, if we're trying to invert the conversation and have local community contexts be what drives public policy decision-making around investment, rules on investment, rules on how things get built, what gets built, how can this pilot provide a path forward for all sorts of investors, institutional investors, impact investors, like Atif's been going in the chat about very helpfully. Could we see out of the pilot, we could point a way forward that says, this is what place-based policymaking and investment needs to look like to strengthen community economies. And we want to pull apart the old way of doing it and illustrate to you why this is the new way to do it. So I'm wondering if Craig, if you want to say anything on that, and maybe Matthew Mendelson.
I think the pilot projects will be instructive in a number of different ways.
Okay.
The area that I'm sort of closest to is on the data collection side of things. And I think part of the issue, and this goes back to, an observation Zita once made about how, if the person making the decision on the ferry schedule actually understood the local community, the time of the ferry would be completely different than it actually is, right? And I think the reality is that a lot of decisions that are made that impact communities are not informed by good data. And so I think that, the component of this project that's going to illustrate, what data is available and where the data shortages are, particularly talking to I'm looking forward to talking with the economic development officers of each of the communities and saying, like, what data do you actually use to make your decisions? Because I have a sneaking suspicion we're going to find out they aren't armed with the information they need, right? And then once you have more data about what's going on in the local community, I think it becomes easier for communities to engage with policymakers on the issues they're facing. So I think that's one illustration.
Yeah, I mean, I'd rather go even further and say the ferry shouldn't be being operated by the federal government. They're way too far away from that, right? And so we should actually try to push the authority and the decision making to a local entity that makes those calls.
Yeah,
right?
well, and that's part of it as well, right? Like it's like you're making decisions that affect us, but you don't actually understand the implications of your decisions, right? I mean, something that hasn't come up, but I've been thinking a lot about is the sense of the project is that communities don't get enough attention and their voice aren't heard. What's interesting about that observation is that politicians definitely think in terms of communities, right? Like MPs and ministers of parliament, like they're all about community. It seems to be what happens somewhere between the political interest in the community and then the actual decisions that are made in terms of policy. Community gets lost somewhere along that line, right? And I think that's part of what we can sort of illustrate in terms of the pilot projects.
Great, thank you. I'm going to jump into you, Matthew, and then next over to Robert.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to talk really, really quickly. I apologize. I have something like from, a foreign world. I'm actually going to a meeting somewhere at 3:30. So I'm in transit. I know everyone's forgotten what physical meetings are like. I'm really grateful to be here. And Mary's question, I don't think I have an answer for yet, but it is the key question and I'm struggling with it. And I can also do some problem definition here, but I think we're working our way towards something. And I think Craig's two observations around data, my understanding is local, we have very poor data on a lot of local community kinds of issues, which is an obstacle. And second, that politicians do think about community, but public administration doesn't. So just to return to the pillar there on the slide deck, the public policy pillar is really important, and it's something I'm working on actively, and we can talk about lots of things afterwards or offline. But I think it has to include the question of public administration as well. So public policy in its broadest sense, because all of the things we are talking about collectively, there are so many systems which stand in the way of all of it. And most of it is implicit. But for example, our public accounting and budgeting, we measure expenditure. We certainly don't measure long-term impact. Although we talk about quality of life or community well-being, and the current government will try and put it into stuff, real economists at the Ministry of Finance don't really think about it, and it's not part of the real conversation. Treasury Board officials, when they're writing terms and conditions about how grants can be allocated, even though politicians want to be responsive and experimental and innovate and have feedback loops and do developmental evaluation and be responsive to local community feedback and co-develop with communities. Other than the occasional initiative like the Smart Cities Initiative, which the people from Peterborough would be familiar with, I mean, there are occasional initiatives that really try and co-create at the local level with community and take ownership of an agenda. Treasury Board terms and conditions for any grant never have local feedback, community adjustment, they're national in scope. So we could go on and on about these things, how we use procurement, how we measure community benefits, all kinds of different issues. But how we do all of these things in public administration stands in opposition to what we collectively are trying to drive. And I'm happy to talk more about those, sometime. But that's my observation on this conversation. But I think that now more than ever is a time when hopefully we can make some progress on these things, because so many of the people who are the keepers of the conventional wisdom now do understand that sustainability has to be part of investment decisions. It's not an add-on. It's not a corporate social responsibility about redistribution afterwards. Sustainability, climate finance, these are real things. And so we're starting to embed inclusion, sustainability, these kinds of things into business decisions. So it's time that government can figure out how to arrange its tools to embed a lot of these things, including the idea of community, into its tools. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. It brings us back to that people, place, and planet again in so many words. So Robert, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. And I only have a couple of minutes also. So first, an ungrounded assessment, because I'm not party to the process. And that is, in these emergent pilot priorities, it seems to me that there's a distinction that is not being made. And that distinction is, what are the priorities related to the piloting that goes on in the 5 pilot communities, and how do we, set ourselves up for success in terms of those pilots and the learnings that will come from those pilots. And I don't see anything in these priorities that talks about citizen innovation and the relationship with citizens. Communities are not communities like a thing. Communities are a collective of human beings. And so I see that completely missing. And then there's a lot, the latter priorities here, while they could be things that happen that emerge out of a community developing its own path forward. You know, I see still way too much of us doing to community here and dealing with some of these other grandiose problems. And, you know, not to be, you know, confrontational about it, but the commentary earlier about, you know, you want to go in and have conversation with the local economic development officer. Well, half the communities or more that we're talking about, they don't have an economic development officer. They don't even know where to start. So, you know, my sense is where is the citizen engagement and the ability to create new possibility for citizens to think that they can come together in some way, that they can start to plot their own destiny and work on with their assets. And so I think there's a distinction between what we want to do in the pilot projects, and then what we want to do is this overarching grandiose organization that's going to, make some, carrying on the future, assuming some success of the pilot. So I think you need to separate those into two distinct set of priorities.
Okay, so I want to give a chance to respond to that. I'm wondering, Zita, do you want to jump in on that? Or Dor, you as well?
I don't think you have to defend it. I'm just making a commentary.
Yeah, I'm just, I know
I'm throwing a bun without allowing you to throw a bun back, so.
there's, I think I could, is it correct that I could summarize what you've said, Robert, as, wanting to make sure that we have got very local, the many locals that we've engaged in this, that they can see themselves and this pilot relevance to their own community, to citizens within their own communities. Is that another way to say what you've?
No, well, partially. What I'm saying is, I think there's a distinction that needs to be made between when I see emergent pilot priorities is what priorities happen inside the pilots and what priorities do we take away or SureFast, whoever the larger organization, in terms of what it's doing with the results of those pilots. And I think those are two separate distinct things, and should have two sets of priorities, and mulching them together to me doesn't bring clarity of purpose.
Robert, the one thing I would add to, I get what you're saying. The one thing I would add is to say in our definition of communities, which is more or less Rajan's definition, it includes citizens, absolutely. And it includes the institutions and associations that they already have, that in one way or another, wholly or partially, properly or not, are a part of that community. So that one of the things that I think we all know who worked on the ground, closely on the ground, is that within a community, we actually don't have those structures for understanding what do our citizens think or want. It's just hard work because there's no natural way for that to, but yes, it's always keeping the most important thing, the most important thing.
Yeah. And I think, my concern is that, we have a historic thrownness or way of thinking that has appeared in how we act, and the over concentration on individualism. And if you could take kind of an Aristotle approach to human being only shows up in community. The only way that one realizes the fullness of being human is in a community. And so the whatever we're doing in community is to free up possibilities for the actual individual person living in their community and their possibilities and so forth. So maybe it's in those first two buckets, and there's more behind those two things. But I just found that a little bit confusing for me, and not distinguishing between the priorities of the community project and the priorities of the overall project in terms of what it does with the results.
Let's make it clearer.
Thank you.
So
sorry, I have to leave.
Yes, we're at time right now, so I think we've had the final word there. But I want to thank everybody for your time today and your contribution, and as well those of you who lend your support to the project as well. So we'll keep these dialogues going, and very open to hear your feedback in between as well as we continue along together. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.